Welcome everyone to this SPICE webinar on Visualizing the Essential, Mexicans in the U.S. Agricultural Workforce. I first want to start by thanking you all for joining us during these tumultuous times. Everyone is having a different experience right now, and I don't know what your experience is, whether it's being home with kids and homeschooling or something else, but I hope you are healthy. I hope you are safe, and we really appreciate you joining us for this webinar. So this webinar is a joint collaboration between the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford University and the Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education. The Center for Latin American Studies, also known as CLASS, is a U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center for Latin America committed to outreach to the scholarly community in California and the United States. CLASS is an academic community that supports research and teaching in all fields of study as they relate to Latin America and the Caribbean. SPICE, or the Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education, serves as a bridge between Stanford University and K-12 schools and community colleges by developing multidisciplinary curricular materials on international topics and conducting teacher professional development seminars, as well as teaching distance learning courses. So a little bit about this webinar and some logistics. This webinar will be recorded, so you will be able to view this webinar afterwards. So feel free to share it to colleagues or others who you think might be interested. And we'll begin this webinar with our guest speaker and his prepared remarks. That'll be about 20 to 25 minutes. Following his prepared remarks, we'll open it up to a Q&A. I will be reading the questions that you submit, and I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the talk. Whenever you come up, whenever you have an idea for a question, feel free to add the question to the Q&A button, which you should see on the bottom of your screen. So let's test that out. If someone would be willing to write a question in the Q&A box, go ahead and do so, and we'll see if we can get this working. Oh, hello, what's your name? Oh, thank you. That's a really good question. Hello, my name is Jonas Edman. I think I forgot to say that. I'm an instructional designer at SPICE. So I will be facilitating this webinar. Thank you, Louise, for that excellent question. And Elizabeth, excited to be here. Excited to have you here as well. Great, and let's see, if I click on answer live, then I've answered those questions. Perfect. So we know that the technology is working, which means that we can move on with the webinar. And as I said, keep on writing the questions as we go along, and then we'll have quite a bit of time afterwards, after the prepared talks, for our guest speaker to answer the questions. So a little bit about today's topic. During multiple periods of economic crises, the U.S. economy has depended on Mexican labor. From World War II to the present, agricultural workers have been deemed essential to harvest our fruits and vegetables across the United States. The Bracero Program began during World War II during a massive labor shortage due to the war and internment of Japanese Americans. It was the largest worker program agreement in the United States history. Over 4.5 million contracts were awarded to young male Mexican immigrants from 1942 to 1964 to work in the railroad and agricultural industries. Moreover, during the current health pandemic, agricultural workers have been categorized as essential workers by the federal government. Yet many workers lack legal status to work in the United States. Dr. Ignacio Ornelas Rodriguez has conducted extensive research and oral histories with former braceros. In this seminar, he'll discuss significant topics in Mexican-American history, including the history of the Bracero Program, agricultural history in California, and the current H-2A guest worker program. The webinar will broaden educators' understanding of Mexican and Mexican-American history and help prepare them to provide instruction that is culturally inclusive. So with that introduction, I will hand things over to our guest speaker today, Dr. Ignacio Ornelas Rodriguez.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. A couple of things. I just wanted to go over that by the end of today's webinar, you should be able to have a better understanding of what the Bracero program was all about, its significance, and also the importance of this program in the history of not just Mexican history, but also United States history. I'm going to be focusing on one particular region, but really this is a story that was very common throughout California. The map I'm actually showing right now is of the Salinas Valley, an area that I'll be talking about throughout my talk here in a second. My talk today will first provide a brief history of the agricultural workforce. Secondly, I will be discussing my research surrounding the Bracero era of 1942 to 1964 and provide primary sources from the Ernesto Galarza collection at Stanford. Lastly, I will share oral histories I conducted with braceros, the importance of their legacy in educating future generations, and how braceros want to be remembered. Because of writers like John Steinbeck, which many of you are familiar with, we have learned about the beautiful regions of the larger Monterey Bay area, and of mice and men based right outside of Soledad and Chulad, and in east of Eden, of course. Yet, little is known about the majority of the laborers who worked in these regions. The historical image of the laborer who toiled in the area is far from a former Mexican worker who migrated legally during the Bracero program. These workers have always been, quote, essential to the American economy. The history of farm workers in California is long, dating back to indigenous people in the 18th century. Many indigenous communities and their labor were exploited to grow the vast agricultural economy that surrounded the missions. During the Mexican era, the ranchos grew enormously, setting the foundation for a booming hide trade and agriculture economy. As immigrants flocked to California during the Mexican and US period, agriculture depended heavily on Mexican workers and of course Chinese immigrants who had previously worked on the railroad. Mexican labor grew through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mexican and Japanese workers in Oxnard, California, organized one of the first multiracial labor unions with the Japanese Mexican Labor Association in 1903. Japanese immigrants were pioneers in developing an expansive vegetable and fruit industry across California, including the Santa Clara Valley orchards, what we know now as Silicon Valley, but also in the Salinas Valley with crops such as lettuce and strawberries. African Americans also have a long history in California agriculture, initially recruited to develop cotton growing techniques in the Central Valley during the late 19th century, and later settled permanently in regions like Corcoran, California to work in agriculture. Filipino migrants worked in agriculture dating back to the 19th century, but their numbers expanded through the 1920s and 1930s when they became pioneers in the labor movement, establishing crucial labor organizations in Salinas and in Guadalupe, California. The Great Depression saw a large population of white migrants arrive from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and other states to work. Many of these migrants eventually founded farming and packaging companies. Notable names are the Anno and Ramsey families from the Salinas Valley. The history of California agriculture is truly an ethnic mosaic of the world. By the 1940s, row crops such as lettuce, cauliflower, and broccoli were replacing sugar beet production in greater quantities. A new era of industrial agriculture was heavily mechanized and the labor became more regimented. Workers worked longer and bodies suffered. As demand for staple products like lettuce grew across the country, demand for laborers also grew. While the 1930s allowed some gains in labor organizing, the beginning of World War II swept workers into the home front military industry, and thousands were drafted. Men and women left the fields and canneries for the military assembly factories of Richmond, Long Beach, and other cities in California. a demand for laborers was exacerbated because of Japanese-American internment in 1942. A large percentage of the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were interned were agriculture pioneers like the Tanamura family from the Salinas Valley. Thousands were incarcerated during internment, and the United States needed workers. Agricultural workers have been deemed essential through the past century. Previously, during World War I, the US had a temporary guest worker agreement with Mexico. By 1942, during the US escalation and entry into World War II, the US again looked south to Mexico for workers. The initial agreement was only supposed to last the length of World War II. The first braceros arrived in Stockton, California on September 13th, 1942. They immediately became essential workers, and they eventually would save the industry. I've been conducting research and documenting the history of braceros and their legacy in the Salinas Valley in Watsonville, California for some time now. My interest in learning about braceros was ignited by my grandfather's personal bracero journey. Who were these men? What were their contributions, and why is so little known about how they viewed their work? As a former bracero, my grandfather shared stories of betterment and progress. He spoke about working with honor in the fields of the Salinas Valley. He described his work in agriculture very differently from the common narrative of a victimized farm worker. Growing up, I was often frustrated as I heard stories about the docile farm worker. The stories of agricultural workers taught in schools were, for the most part, about how terrible farm work conditions were and how the public should feel pity for them. But having grown up in a farm worker family, I learned a very different story. Yes, the work was very difficult, but my family members learned to navigate the arduous labor and took great pride in their skilled work and production of vegetables. Hay que tener ley, my grandfather would teach us. Ley in Mexican working class culture is a tremendously important concept that stems from Mexicanos' fiercely independent, autonomous, and self-sufficient ways. The Spanish term ley means to have honor, courage, to do things in life well when you encounter an obstacle. Ley also carries a sense of pride, like the word orgullo. This is how my grandfather described doing hard agricultural work. I began conducting numerous oral history interviews with former braceros and wanted to learn about their experience directly from them and not secondary sources. I anticipated hearing stories of worker abuse and exploitation because, after all, some scholars called braceros modern day slaves, quote, modern day slaves, end of quote. I expected to hear stories of oppressed and victimized farm workers, but I heard a very different narrative. Former braceros shared stories of having used the experience in the program as a launching pad to greater opportunities in the agricultural industry. So, drawing heavily from interviews I conducted with braceros that worked in the Salinas Valley and Watsonville, my research analyzes their experience and pays special attention to how they viewed their work. My research offers a previously under-discussed perspective that is at odds with the most popular narrative regarding braceros. I argue that many of them remember their work with dignity, as opposed to viewing themselves as victims. The braceros I spoke with shared a narrative that departs from previously held beliefs of the program. Their stories were about hope and the opportunity to improve their lives and to make a lasting contribution to their family through difficult working conditions. Their personal accounts in the Salinas Valley and Watsonville demonstrate how the bracero scholarship formally has been one-dimensional. Despite this departure from the mainstream, it is not the goal here today to dismiss an exploitation narrative found in the bracero literature. Rather, I aim to offer additional perspectives found within the stories of the Braceros themselves, of agency, of progress, and their children, a second generation that transformed the political landscape of regions like the Monterey Bay Area. Up until a few years ago, there was no historical marker that recognized the labor contributions made by former Braceros, and their history is hardly taught. The former Braceros I interviewed toiled for decades in California. This is the land Braceros worked in, yet the region hardly has any recognition of their contributions. No marker, no plaque, no statue, no building commemorating how their labor made Monterey County the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is today. The first Braceros contracted to work in the Monterey Bay Area arrived in Salinas in 1942. They began working in the sugar beet and celery fields of the Salinas Valley. 2 years before they arrived, the value of Monterey County agriculture products was about $17 million. By the end of the Bracero program in 1964, the value was $152 million. The pictures, articles, and documents detailing the Braceros' arrival demonstrate how they were initially welcomed with patriotic fervor, citing the collaboration of both US and Mexico cooperating to win World War II. President Franklin Roosevelt even proclaimed his support for the program. He said, quote, "Mexican farm workers brought to the US in accordance with the agreement between our two governments are contributing their toil to the production of vitally needed food," end of quote. In a Southern Pacific magazine, Braceros were called Soldados del Ferrocarril, soldiers of the railroad. And on the front page, about 50 are shown holding the US and Mexican flag, signaling V for victory during World War II. However, these celebrations were short-lived, and soon thereafter, Braceros were guided by police escorts to their labor camps in the outskirts of town. While some Braceros were welcomed, many faced racial and ethnic discrimination, and domestic agricultural workers viewed Braceros as competition for scarce jobs. Unlike the steel builders of the East, who have been memorialized through photographs as they built the New York City skyscrapers, farm workers from the region have hardly been recognized. Braceros began working with the infamous Cortito, but some of them, like Oscar Calderon, had his eye on other jobs with the agricultural industry as an irrigator, a tractor driver, or a supervisor. These men enjoyed working in the agricultural industry. During my interview with Leon Ventura, who began working as a bracero, I learned that he eventually served in the US Army. Mr. Ventura served with distinction and returned to his position as a cauliflower supervisor with the Bud Anno Corporation and later Dole. He had a remarkable story to tell about his career in agriculture. It was not about feeling pity for him. On the contrary, Mr. Ventura told the story of progress, of having mastered the work. "Yo nunca me rajé." I never gave up, he proclaimed. Mr. Ventura was also an inventor and innovated agricultural machinery to prevent worker injuries. These were stories I was familiar with from my youth because my family spoke about the ingenuity in the fields, the innovation, the camaraderie that took place among workers. Braceros that I interviewed took pride in working with their equipment, their tools, and the machinery, a narrative we don't hear enough. Leon Ventura and his wife put children through Princeton, Berkeley, and Santa Clara universities. One daughter is a doctor in Salinas. His daughter, Ana Ventura Fares, was elected the first female and Mexican-American mayor of Watsonville, California. The son of a former Bracero, Simon Salinas, became the first Mexican-American elected to the city council in Salinas and just retired as a Monterey County supervisor. Other elected officials have also served and were the children of former Braceros. Abel Maldonado became a California lieutenant governor. Juan Vargas is currently in the US Congress. Professors at UCLA, Berkeley, and Stanford had Bracero parents. The first chair of the California Strawberry Commission, Lorena Chavez, an entrepreneur from Santa Maria, is the daughter of a former bracero from Jalisco. Mr. Rafael Silva and his wife, Eva Silva, who I interviewed, have successful children who are doctors, entrepreneurs, and their son, Francisco Silva, is the general counsel for the California Medical Association. So some of you might wonder, how common is this narrative? Since there were over 2 million braceros. Perhaps these examples are on one spectrum of the bracero experience, but we haven't heard of them, and they need to be shared. You would be surprised, but they are more common than we might think. For certain scholars, the stories of the Bracero program are examples of frightful and exploitative labor conditions that braceros lived through as guest workers in the United States. Braceros were heavily exploited. Worker abuses were common, and many died in terrible accidents. The most notorious at Chulat, where 32 braceros tragically died. Being so far away from their homes, braceros suffered depression and anxiety, and some fled and never returned. But we know that thousands also viewed the program as an opportunity to meet new friends, establish new work, social networks, and the opportunity to stay in the United States. So there is an alternative narrative that braceros such as Salvador Flores Barragan, who shared about his experience. His story is an example of how braceros wanted to improve their lives by migrating to work in US agriculture. As a survivor of the terrible tragedy at Chulat on September 17, 1963, his journey sheds light on how braceros saw the program as an opportunity to better their lives, even if it meant putting their lives in danger. Their ganas, desire to work, and the skills they possessed have been left out of the narrative. For many historians, the research is housed in the archives, and our writings are presented to a select few scholars within our field. If we are lucky, a greater audience is exposed to our work. My research and work in public history is about educating a larger population. It's about what the writer Anne Loftus stated when she analyzed the works of John Steinbeck, of photographer Dorothea Lange, the scholar Paul Taylor, and journalist Carrie McWilliams. Loftus stated that, quote, their documentary writing interpreting the events of the Depression decade was as significant as an outgrowth of our national democratic tradition of investigation, of protest, expose, and analysis. She added that in the final analysis, it was the artists who gave history a human face. My research and collaboration across disciplines provides a new interpretation of the bracero experience of pride and dignity. For me, it's critical that humanists work transnationally across borders. My collaboration with an artist in Mexico, for example, has taken my research outside of academia to reach and educate a larger populace hungry for a history that gives them recognition and affirmation that they too made major contributions. This is a generation of young people that need this history. The Bracero program ended in 1964, but today the H-2A program is recruiting hundreds of Mexican farm workers. So how far have we ultimately come since the labor crisis in 1942? During the current pandemic, farm workers are deemed essential while many don't have permanent legal status. We eat fruit and fruit salads, drink wine, right? But don't ever ask who harvests our food and what types of protections they have. Times have certainly changed and regulations are much stricter. However, employers continue to recruit H-2A guest workers, which is pretty much a new Bracero program. But a new generation of leaders has demanded better protections for workers, including better housing. For example, employers like the Tanamura and Nano company, this is a company that was actually founded by Japanese Americans who lived through internment and migrants from Texas during the Great Depression. They have recently built affordable housing for their guest workers. They also provide some of the best wages, healthcare, and retirement benefits. But there are other painful stories of workers living in terrible conditions, crammed together in small spaces, leading to outbreaks of COVID-19. My research on the Bracero program has given life to the Ernesto Galarza collection, and I'll be sharing some photographs here. The collaboration at Stanford has been, or excuse me, the collection at Stanford has been revived. It's now outside of the archive. In this collection, you see the images of workers and the daily reality that they face when they arrive to work with a short handle hoe as they stoop over for long periods doing this backbreaking work. You see the recruiters visiting potential workers, inspecting, physically handling them to check for skills and strength. Braceros were sprayed with DDT, a chemical that was eventually banned. But the photographs also show images of hope and braceros on their way to the promised land. The way we have seen so many images of European immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. These are images of hope, of progress, and of an immigrant generation that wanted what others before them hoped for, a better future for their children and for future generations. My research seeks to give greater voice and recognition to Bracero labor. Through historical research, I aim to articulate a new narrative of hope and progress. This concludes this part of my presentation. I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you so much for that overview of the very important research that you are doing regarding the Braceros program and offering, I think through your research, turning a often one-dimensional narrative and understanding of the Bracero program into a multidimensional narrative and understanding, which is incredibly important. I'd like to take the opportunity now to open up to Q&A, and we've already gotten a few questions, and I encourage all of you to continue to write questions into the Q&A box, and I will go ahead and ask the questions. So our first question comes from an anonymous attendee. It says, what do you think shaped the more traditional narrative of exploitation of Mexican farm workers that is more well known versus the perspectives of dignity and opportunity that you found in your research?
That's a great question, and it's definitely a debate among academics and historians. I argue that it really goes back to the researchers at the very beginning of the program, like Ernesto Galarza, who, if some of you don't know who Ernesto Galarza is really, he's an individual who set the foundation for people like Cesar Chavez. He's a labor organizer, but he's also an academic and he's a writer. And he was actually hired by the federal government to study worker abuses, which were frightful. Braceros lived in some of the most terrible working conditions. They were, like I said earlier, heavily exploited. there's no arguing that narrative. And so you have a generation of scholars and academics that are on the ground conducting a lot of this research. And they're reporting like Carrie McWilliams as journalists. They're going to places like the US-Mexico border, and they're finding that workers are in fact waiting long periods to get contracted. Once they arrive in places like Salinas, the living quarters are terrible. The abuses that you saw of workers working with a short handle hoe are backbreaking. There are a number of accidents that are occurring during the Bracero program where workers are losing limbs and actually dying, right, through these terrible transportation accidents. So definitely there's this narrative that came out of the 1940s and 1950s that was really a reality. You have a lot of workers leaving. And so you have a generation of reporters and academics reporting what they're viewing, but they're also viewing it from a distance. Although Ernesto Galarza, who's an amazing academic and labor organizer, actually did interview braceros and asked them about their experiences. There's a number of individuals who were writing from afar, right? And not really studying the progress of how some of these braceros eventually settled after 1964, how they ended up in places like the Monterey Bay Area. They established themselves in the industry even after the program ended. You have a generation of academics who today are conducting extraordinary archival research, but also have the opportunity of hindsight and are interviewing braceros like I did and asking them, Mr. Rodriguez, well, what do you think about the program and how do you view that experience? And so this is a story that now they have the privilege of hindsight, right? And looking back and saying, perhaps like someone who joins the military, wow, you know, those 4 years in the military or my 4 years in the Bracero program, likewise, actually set the foundation, right? But, you know, it's really about going to the braceros themselves and asking them directly that question. How did you view the program? You know, I'm privileged because I speak Spanish, so my conversation with braceros is in their primary language. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I hope I answered that. The narrative eventually, I think, changes a little bit because you're interviewing braceros directly. The research is on the ground and much more extensive as opposed from afar.
Thank you for that answer. And I should say, feel free to post follow-up questions if you like in the Q&A section for everyone that's here. Okay, our next question comes from Luis Rodriguez. He asks, do you know if the narrative of the farm workers in the Salinas Valley has changed through the generations? He wonders what the realities of current farm workers are like.
That's also a very good question. You know, the reality is that farm workers still suffer greatly. There's a number of health disparities, you know, in places like the Salinas Valley, you know, high poverty rates. The town of Salinas, the neighborhood of East Salinas is one of the most densely populated communities, neighborhoods in the entire country. Over 33,000 people live in a 1 mile radius. Not many parks, not many, you know, areas for recreation. There's a lot of worker injuries to this day. But as I argue in my research, there is a new generation of leaders that have been elected over the last, I would say, about 20, 30 years. There was actually a civil rights movement, as many other scholars have argued, in the Salinas Valley that paved the way to have better representation for farm workers. I mean, including the United Farm Workers of America, the UFW, who has done a tremendous job over the last 50 years of really demanding better working conditions, better wages, better housing, access to healthcare. And so there have been significant changes that have been won. That photograph of the workers working with the short handle hoe, for example, that tool was eventually banned because it was literally breaking backs and ending, putting farm workers on disability for the remainder of their life. And with the work of civil rights organizations like CRLA, MALDEF, and the United Farm Workers, they were able to actually ban the use of a tool in the industry. You have the UFW, for example, fighting for shade. We've had a heat wave in Silicon Valley, and in places like Central Valley, where the heat can go upwards of over 100. Farm workers were still dying just a few years ago from exhaustion. So to answer Luis's question is that definitely workers still suffer tremendously, but I also believe that companies, because of this lobbying from a new leadership, have provided better housing. The photograph that you can see here is of a company in Spreckles, California that provide housing for guest workers. And if you look at the apartment, it's not so bad. It's, plenty of recreation space. And I've actually been out there to talk to some of the workers. The company pays them some of the highest wages, but this is on one spectrum, right? This is like your ideal employer. There are still a number of abuses that have been found out in the Salinas Valley where farm workers continue to struggle with the proper protections out in the fields. But I also believe that there's a new generation of scholars who are also going directly to the workers and providing a better analysis of how this work is highly skilled. Frank Bardacke, one of my good friends who wrote a very important book, Trampling Out the Vintage, which I highly recommend, he was one of the first who really said, you call this work unskilled, but try doing it for an hour, try it for 30 minutes. You have to make decisions about, which vegetable or fruit to cut or pick. You have to trim it. You have to package it. You have to then move on to the next one, all in a matter of seconds. And so scholars have really now been analyzing, this work is very difficult. It's hard to do. Not everyone can do it. And so corporations also who hire them have also, it's not that they ever denied it, but I think they're finally coming to terms that, they need to treat their workers better.
Okay, thank you for that. So our next question comes from Jose Castillo. He says, thank you for this. Where can educators access these materials, collections, to have students do an analysis and build a well-rounded viewpoint on the Bracero program?
Well, that's a great question. I'm very lucky because my work at the Stanford Department of Special Collections and University Archives, with the support of a number of different people there, but specifically someone who's been there for over 30 years, Roberto Trujillo, who's the director of Special Collections, has really been supportive of us going out there and acquiring collections, but not just acquiring. If you've ever worked in the archives, it's a very how can I say this? It's a very quiet space. Not many people have access. It's hard to get access. And so with the support of Stanford University, the director, the department, they have been adamant about getting these photographs, getting these documents out to the larger public so that we can create lesson plans, provide the primary sources. So to answer your question, there's a lot of these sources on the Stanford University Library's website. I also have to thank my collaboration with SPICE, at Stanford and with the Center for Latin American Studies, who have been very supportive in providing these events. This is not the first. A few years back, we organized an event at Stanford where we recognized the Braceros I interviewed, and we brought them to the university. We brought their family members, and the director, Dr. Gary Mukai, has been very supportive. But SPICE actually has a lot of these lesson plans that you can access on their website. And there's a number of other websites. The Smithsonian has a very important archive where you can actually access the oral history interviews. This is all on the internet. It's called the Bracero Archive.org. And but I also want to say that these stories are not just in the archive. They're in your communities. You'd be surprised. I mean, my grandfather worked as far as the East Coast later in life, but he also lived in Chicago, Illinois for a time. And I mean, the Braceros are getting older. Unfortunately, we're losing them. But you'd be surprised. They are your students' grandparents. A large population of the Mexican American population across the country, if they are not related to a Bracero, someone from their hometown knows of a former Bracero. So what I'm trying to get at is that these stories are also very local. You don't necessarily have to go searching for them in a library.
I think you touched on this a little bit in your answer right now. And perhaps you can talk a little bit more about it, because there's a question here from an anonymous attendee that says, I saw photos of Braceros honored by Stanford. Can you talk a little bit more about these photos?
Yeah, let's see if I could get the pictures. Well, that event really came about, my collaboration with the Stanford program on international and cross-cultural education. I was actually a student as an educator in that program. And when I took courses with SPICE, with the different educators there, and actually that program was really a study of Asian American history, Asian and Asian American history. And I learned a lot about Japanese American internment, and I learned about a new generation that was also looking back at that history, a very painful history, a history that a lot of people didn't want to relive. But there was a second and third generation that finally went back to their parents and grandparents and said, we really need to share this history so that the rest of the world knows about this very dark, terrible history. And so I learned about how they were able to create memorials, right? And also lesson plans. And so I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about this and very thankful for that education so that we could provide a more diverse history of the country. I started to think, where are these events? Where are these historical public history events for our parents, grandparents? Where's our legacy? And so I began to collaborate with people like Dr. Mukai at SPICE, told them about recognizing these former braceros that I had conducted extensive research with. And let me tell you, he was just very, very supportive. And so we brought braceros and their family members about 6 years ago to Stanford. And it was very important for us to invite their children, their grandchildren, so that they could see that grandpa, it's one thing to hear the stories from your parents and grandparents when you're at home, and especially in a different language, right? When they try to tell you, hey, you see those fields? I worked out there and this was very difficult work. But it's another thing when they experience it, right? And so the idea was to bring the young generation, a future generation, to see this academic institution really recognize the importance of how essential braceros were not just to World War II, but also to saving an industry that was about to really collapse. You saw the chart and how much the agricultural industry grew here in the United States. And that's really something that I really like to encourage and promote. This is a generation that doesn't know about these stories. This is a generation that doesn't really have a memorial or a place to go and pay respect to these workers. A few years ago, finally, in the Salinas Valley, with the work with advocates, activists, and public historians there, and the support of a number of different legislators, Luis Alejo, Simón Salinas, Senator Ana Caballero, they designated about a 17-mile stretch officially the Bracero Memorial Highway. And that was where that terrible accident happened in Chular in 1963.
Thank you. I know I speak for everyone at Splice that was one of the most moving and profound events and experiences that I've had working surviving the Braceros honored at Stanford with their families. So there's quite a few questions here regarding your research. So I thought I'd ask them together so you can answer them. So one is from Marcia Valente. She says, do you plan on continuing your research and interviewing former Braceros? If so, how can Braceros contact you? Elizabeth Dominguez writes, were the Braceros you interviewed open to sharing their story right away, or did you have to build relationships? And similarly, Maria D asks, with the research that you conducted, did the Braceros feel lied to or deceived about the program, or did you find the contrary?
Well, those are all really good questions. You know, obviously I always want to disclose that there were over 2 million Braceros that were contracted. So the stories, the interviews that I conducted are just a very small fraction of the entirety of every single experience. But you really have a combination of everything. You have workers who were told they were going to be paid a certain wage. They were going to be working in a specific region. And then everything changes. I haven't really brought up, but, or yet, is that Braceros were also promised a pension, which eventually they never received. There was a lot of news about this about 15 years ago. When Braceros were getting older, they were getting into their 70s and 80s. This was a pension that was supposed to be given to them once they reached retirement. They never saw it. They never received it. So definitely money was stolen from them. Wages were taken. You know, there was always a threat by growers that, you know, they could easily be deported. Braceros did not have a lot of opportunities to go and work with other employers. Their contract specifically stated you have to stay with this employer. So you could clearly see the kinds of abuses that were occur. I think Braceros were initially, you know, you're young, you're 18, you're in your early 20s, and you think of the program as an adventure, but you see the stark realities when you get there, especially if you don't have an agricultural background from your family in Mexico. And so when they arrived to work with that short handle hoe, they realized like really what they got into. You know, the kinds of inspections that they went through, you know, these were, for a lot of these workers, very, very traumatic experiences that they had a very difficult time talking about for many years. It was very hard for them to talk to their immediate families about these conditions. But as I said earlier, in hindsight, you know, you do have to build a relationship. It's like with any group, right? You cannot just helicopter into a community, although some people do that. And all of a sudden knock on someone's house and say, hey, I have questions about your experience as an agricultural worker. You know, Braceros read you like anyone. They want to know your background, like what's your objective. I've worked on a couple of different you know, projects, and that is one of the questions, like, what's the ultimate objective? You know, for me, it's really to share these stories with the world, with students, with educators. People do not make the connection. People drive through places like the Salinas Valley and the workers are really far away, not ever getting close to the work and knowing how difficult it is. And so it's a very difficult experience. It is very hard research, but you definitely have to build a relationship. There were about 3 questions there. I hope I answered them.
There was the one question is, how can Braceros contact you now?
Oh, yes.
Continue your research.
Yeah, I'm definitely still interviewing Braceros, and the university is obviously still very interested in archiving, actually photographs, letters. You know, it is my goal as Braceros are reaching an older age and obviously passing away, is that we need to document their personal photographs, but also their writings, conduct more interviews. And, you know, people could get a hold of me through the Bracero Legacy project, which is on Facebook, very easy to find. Or you could always find me through my Stanford affiliation. And it's okay to give my email? And that's just Ornelas@stanford.edu. You could always send me an email, and I could share lesson plans, other primary sources that educators can also use in the classroom.
Okay, thank you. So next question, Victor Madrigal asks, what social, political, economic conditions would need to be in place for a modern day program to be implemented between USA and Mexico or Central American countries that would provide a fair wage, safe, dignified, respectful, and well-paying program that's beneficial to both parties?
Well, that's a really good question. There is the current H-2A guest worker program, and there are thousands of braceros that are they don't call them braceros anymore. Agricultural workers from Mexico, and now more and more so Central America. I've spoken to employers in places like the Salinas Valley, and people think it's very easy to go to places like Mexico and recruit workers. But, you know, as I spoke earlier, this work is not easy to do. It's highly skilled. It takes time. You know, growing up, I remember when my grandfather, he was no longer a bracero, but he worked in agriculture. Individuals would go to his apartment in the Hebron Heights neighborhood in East Salinas to learn how to cut lettuce from him. This is before they ever planted a foot in the fields of the Salinas Valley. And so the idea was for him to pass on that social capital, that knowledge capital to workers so that they could eventually get hired. And so he would spend a day or longer with some of these recruits, teaching them, this is how you cut a piece of lettuce. This is what you're looking for. This is a good product. This is a terrible product. This is a very sharp knife, and this is how you're going to make this cut. This is how you're going to trim it, bag it, and then eventually have to package it and then move on very quickly. And so to answer Victor's question, employers presently are much more strict about who they want to recruit. They go to regions in Mexico and in Central America where, you know, very high poverty rates, but some of the workers may have experience working on farms, working in agriculture. There are mandated minimum wages and housing. Housing is a big issue that employers now have to provide. And in Monterey County, where I've studied the research a lot, you know, there was one case where a potential employer wanted to house I think, you know, a high number of people in bunk beds and these rooms, and, you know, you call that housing. And county supervisors, a supervisor from Monterey County like Luis Alejo and Simone Salinas said, no, this is not appropriate housing. You are not going to build that kind of housing. If you want this project approved, you're going to build better housing, and it needs to be affordable for the workers. And so I argue that because of a new generation in regions like the Monterey Bay Area, there are more guidelines, stricter rules to providing housing, better wages, and also housing that's affordable. But you also have terrible and frightful conditions up north, like in Washington, where there has been exposure to COVID-19, and employers have, you know, been caught not providing the best wages, not providing the best housing. To answer your question, regulation, I think regulation, but also in part collaboration with employers. You know, the Antle family in the Salinas Valley at one point fought Cesar Chavez to ban the short handle hoe back in the 1970s. 30 years later, the Antle family came out and said, we were wrong. We were wrong about that tool. And, you know, the UFW, CRLA, MALDIF were correct. That tool should have never been used out in the fields. And so some growers are more adamant about working together and providing the proper wages and resources.
Okay, our next question comes from Brenda Herrera. Once the Bracero program ended, were the Braceros granted legal status? Were they always legal with a temporary permit?
That's a great question. So a lot of Braceros, basically, by the time the program ended in 1964, were given an option. They could return to Mexico. But what happened is that recruiters, like you see in this photograph, you know, eventually you build a relationship, right? It's not you know, people are humans, and but these workers, as you know, someone's interested in a short documentary teaser that we produced. It's called the Bracero Legacy on YouTube, and we interviewed growers, and growers talked about how these Mexican workers were, you know, just the hardest workers that had worked in that region. And so what happens is that some of these employers sponsor former braceros and help them get, at the time, quote, what they were called were permanent legal status, green cards. And so braceros stay, the braceros that do stay are sponsored by former employers or current employers. And then they eventually apply for citizenship through sponsorship. But really, a lot of them still were undocumented for many years. The story of my grandfather is that he was very lucky because eventually there's a law that's passed in 1986 called the Immigration and Reform and Control Act of 1986, IRCA. And a lot of these former braceros eventually gained legal status through that law. But that's, you know, 16, 20 years later, after the Bracero program ended. For a very long period, they're working as undocumented workers for a long time. But you have the cases of, like Mr. Ventura, he actually stayed. He was sponsored by one of his employers. He actually was drafted into the US military, and other braceros that I interviewed who stayed.
Okay, our next question comes from Amy Ellison. In your research, did you come across any regional differences in the way braceros remembered their experiences? For example, were there stories or experiences unique to braceros in the Central Valley versus those in the Bay Area, which can also help bring new dimensions to this history?
Absolutely, that's a great question. You know, what stands out is Texas. Texas was one of the worst places. It was legally banned at one point from employing braceros. The abuses in that region were, if you thought they were bad in places like the Salinas Valley, I mean, they were just much worse in Texas. Eventually, elected officials in Mexico decide to ban the program from workers going to Texas. And you do have regional differences that you do today as well, where certain employers are a little bit more, will provide the better working conditions, right? They're not as abusive. They provide better housing. The Monterey Bay Area stands out because of the quantity of the braceros, but the braceros were also in Silicon Valley, working in what we know as Silicon Valley now, but it's Santa Clara County. And braceros worked in the orchards. The work also has a lot to do with it, right? There are certain workers who are doing the thinning with the short handle hoe, and that is just extremely terrible work for your body. I mean, literally, bodies are, quote, broken. And then, it's very different than working in an orchard, which is still very difficult work, but it's a very different labor. Employers, there needs to be more research about which employers. I've interviewed a lot of different braceros, and they mention, this employer was better to work with than another. There were terrible stories found out in places like Yuba City, up in Northern California and in Central Valley, where certain employers actually literally incarcerated braceros. They fenced them in. It was almost like an unofficial jail. So you had that in places like in Northern California and Marysville and Yuba City, where they were working in some of the peach orchards. And abuses, there's photographs of braceros that were actually, tied with some kind of, tool, I suppose, to a fence or a pole. And again, fenced in, incarcerated. So definitely time, place, and context is important when you study the bracero research on which area you're talking about. And of course, a lot of them were sprayed with this terrible chemical, DDT, which was eventually banned, through activist work like the United Farmworkers and of course Rachel Carson. But we still don't know what the impact that has been on the longevity of their lives, their careers. But yeah. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, next we have Shannon McEntee, who asks, was there a photo with a Bracero Museum in the background? Where is it, and can I visit?
I don't know. Did I show one with the Bracero Museum? It might have been the Bracero Memorial Highway. I don't know if that's what they're referring to. There was recently, there was a traveling exhibit. Yes, I think that's what she's referring to. There was a traveling exhibit that was organized by the Smithsonian, and I believe you could still, I guess, purchase the traveling exhibit and bring it to your community. And that was done about 10 years ago. It was traveling all over the country, and they bring photographs, stories, but it's temporary. It's not permanent. It's not a permanent museum. But museums across the country have done an incredible job of bringing this traveling exhibit to their communities and highlighting this work over about a 2-3 month period. There was recently in Los Angeles a sculpture that the community organized, and now you could visit a beautiful sculpture of a bracero and his family. And that's it. In the Salinas Valley, the community has done a lot of work in trying to recognize braceros. A lot of public historians have worked together and collaborated. There's that sign that I shared earlier. You could drive by. It's, take a photograph. This is actually a picture of some California Highway Patrol officers who saw the sign, and they all had a grandfather who had been a bracero. And so, you know, they took great pride in the sign and wanted to take these photographs next to that memorial. This is kind of a tragedy in a sense, because it's a beautiful cross and a memorial of this terrible accident that occurred in 1963. But I think we could do better than that. I think, you know, I've been talking to elected officials in that region and others about creating a permanent, you know, sculpture, a memorial where someone, you know, families can go and learn about it. But of course, like anything, it takes resources and time.
Okay, Shelley Grandel says, as an educator in Denver, Colorado, coming from the San Luis Valley in Southern Colorado and having experience in these fields with my family and firsthand, it can be tough trying to teach this through my science class. It can seem so far away from my suburban students and their families. I'm creating a virtual field and worker experience for my classrooms with interviews. Any suggestions in that work?
That is a great question. I mean, I'm fascinated by your work, and you know, this is a program that you could teach. You know, the science behind agriculture, I don't need to get into. The work that they went through, the chemicals and the pesticides that they were exposed to, that eventually were banned by you know, these civil rights and labor organizations. You know, I would encourage her to look at the Bracero Legacy project on Facebook. And we have a lot of these images, you know, free for use, the primary sources to analyze. You know, there's a lot of science, obviously, in agriculture, but the ingenuity, the work that's done. You know, I didn't really talk about this, but here you have photographs of these workers going through medical exams and physicals, and not everyone was chosen. There were a lot of people that were denied the opportunity. But anyway, to answer your question, the Bracero Legacy project on Facebook, and there was another part, second part to that question, where she could find.
Let's see, she writes, I am creating a virtual field and worker experience for my classrooms with interviews.
So, you know, I also encourage her to communicate. There's an artist a few years ago who reached out to me. His name's Daniel Ruanova, and he is an incredible artist, but he uses a lot of, you know, contemporary technology. And he actually, you know, when he read my thesis, he really got motivated and inspired to create this art piece. And what he eventually did was he created this mechanical sculpture of cortitos, of short handle hose. And we have a video of how that works, and you know, the technology involved. His goal was really to showcase the strength and the power and the endurance that these workers had in that sculpture. And so, like I said, there's still a lot of work to do. I think students can get very creative with science and technology, and in teaching us what they see in these primary sources, because every time I teach a seminar or make a presentation and I show these pictures, I learn every single time from the students.
Great, we're just, I just wanted to add that Shelley writes here that it'll be a virtual 3D Google expedition tour through fields with interactive pieces, including interviews. So sounds like a great project. We are in fact out of time. So I would like to thank, first of all everyone who joined us today for this presentation and for your great questions. I feel like we could go on for much longer because it's such an interesting topic and with so many questions to be asked and to be answered. So thank you for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our organizer, Sabrina Ishimatsu, here at SPICE, who really did a wonderful job putting together this webinar, and without whom this would definitely not have been possible. So thank you, Sabrina. Thank you to our colleagues at class for helping organize this webinar. And finally, thank you to Dr. Ignacio Ornelas for your research, Rodriguez, for your research and for everything you do for this important topic. You know, changing the narrative or adding to the narrative, going from a narrative that is all about or mostly about victimhood and exploitation to a narrative that also includes pride, dignity, agency, ingenuity, camaraderie, innovation, and legacy is a project that is incredibly important and something that I hope more students will learn about and will continue for a long time. So thank you so much for being here. And this concludes the webinar for today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.